Uchenna stood by the large glass window of his newly rented apartment in Lekki, Lagos, sipping a cold glass of water. The view was lovely. Life in the rich neighborhood seemed like a dream come true, a far cry from the chaos of his previous residence in Mushi. But that dream came with distraction. He hadn't anticipated distractions like Delilah. Delilah, the neighbor's wife, was a vision of temptation. Her beauty was breathtaking, full lips, eyes that sparkled with mischief, and a body that seemed sculptured by the gods themselves. But it wasn't just her looks. It was the deliberate way she moved, the teasing glances she threw his way. Every night, Uchenna found himself unwittingly drawn to the window. She left her curtains wide open, her silhouette a forbidding painting framed by the glow of her bedroom light as she looks herself in the mirror. Uchenna hated himself for watching, for letting her seductiveness sink its claws into him. One night, guilt finally overcame him. He pulled his curtains shut, vowing never to look again. After a week of resisting the temptation of looking at his neighbor's wife through the window, he found a note pinned to his door. The note read, "Why did you stop watching?" The words chilled him to the bone. His heart raced. Delilah's game was no accident. She was baiting him all along, and the windows she left wide open was deliberate. Uchenna went back to the bad habit of looking at her change her clothes at night. For days, she flaunted herself in provocative, alluring night dresses. One evening, summoning courage laced with guilt, he approached her at the supermarket in their Lekki neighborhood. "She is so beautiful when you come closer to her," Uchenna thought to himself. "Hi," he stammered. She turned, her smile slow. "Uchenna, right? I was wondering when you would stop being so shy." Her boldness threw him off balance. By the time he left, her number was saved in his phone. They started talking, texting at odd hours. She was flirtatious, but there was an edge to her, a darkness he couldn't quite place. He learned she was married to Pa Martin Obaro, a wealthy businessman, far older than her. Delilah, while telling Uchenna about her husband, painted a picture of a loveless, hollow marriage, her words dripping with venom. She said, "I'm just a trophy wife, trapped in a cage, waiting for someone to set me free." Uchenna knew he should walk away, but the way she spoke, the way her voice wove its spell around him, it was impossible to ignore. Weeks passed, and Uchenna's life began to unravel. Out of nowhere, he was fired from his job at the International Humanitarian Office. They handed him a severance package that wouldn't last 2 months. The pressure mounted, rent, bills, and no good job vacancies in sight. Delilah seemed to sense his desperation. She invited him over one evening, and for the first time, Uchenna stepped into her home. The Obaro mansion was lavish, but eerily quiet, as though the house itself held its breath. Pa Martin Obaro was out of town, and they had the house to themselves. They sat in the dimly lit living room, a bottle of wine between them. "I have a proposition," Delilah said, leaning in. Her perfume was intoxicating, and she continued, "Something that could solve all your financial problems, because losing a job and finding another good one is not easy." Uchenna frowned. "What are you talking about? What proposition?" She sighed, her expression shifting from seductive to conspiratory. "My husband has a life insurance policy worth over 50 million naira that no one knows about, but he willed everything else to his sons. If something were to happen to him, the insurance policy would pay out to me directly. All we have to do is to make it look natural, and no one will suspect me after all, because I am not included in his will." Uchenna was shocked. "You want me to kill your husband?" he asked. She placed a hand on his thighs, her touch ice cold, and she said, "I don't want to, but sometimes survival requires sacrifices. He pulled away, his stomach churning. I am not a murderer, Delilah. She smiled as though amused by his indignation. Think about it. You are broke, jobless. This could set you up for life. That night, Uchenna lay awake, her words haunting him. Days turned to weeks, and his financial situation worsened. Desperation clouded his judgment, and so he called Delilah. What's the plan? He asked her. Her plan was simple, yet sinister. They would stage her husband's death as a heart attack in his private office at Ikoyi Street. Delilah would drug him during dinner in their Lekki mansion, and Uchenna would take his unconscious body to the private office at Ikoyi Street. And in the office, Uchenna would suffocate him to death, ensuring it looked natural for the insurance claim. She emphasized timing and precision. Pa Martin's body had to appear fresh to avoid suspicion. The night arrived. Uchenna's hands trembled as he let himself into the mansion. Delilah greeted him in a pink silk robe, her smile sharp and dangerous. Pa Martin was already unconscious in the bedroom. Uchenna stared at the man, guilt clawing at his side. Let's get this over with, Delilah whispered. But something went wrong. The dose of sedatives had been too strong. Pa Martin was already dead. Panic surged through Uchenna. He is not supposed to be dead yet, Uchenna remarked, looking very afraid. Delilah's calm facade cracked, and she said, we can't take him to the hospital. We will put him in the fridge to buy time. Tomorrow we will figure something out. They dragged Martin's lifeless body to the industrial freezer in the basement. Uchenna felt pile rise in his throat as he shut the freezer door. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with activity. Pa Martin's secretary had reported him missing after he failed to show up for an important meeting that day. Police officers swarmed the property, questioning Delilah, who played the grieving wife to perfection. Uchenna stayed away, his nerves shaky. Uchenna paced around in his apartment. The stress was eating him alive. Every time his phone buzzed, he flinched, half expecting the police to come crashing through his door. Delilah had assured him everything was under control, but he knew better. Nothing about this was under control. The first sign of trouble came 2 days after Pa Martin Obaro's disappearance. A young detective named Inspector Femi arrived at the mansion with a sharp eye and sharper questions. Femi wasn't like the other officers who had come and gone. He had a quiet intensity, the kind that made people nervous. Delilah played the role of a worried wife flawlessly, her tears flowing freely. But Femi didn't seem convinced. He lingered, his gaze darting to the smallest detail. Mrs. Obaro, Inspector Femi asked, his voice calm but probing. When was the last time you saw your husband? Delilah hesitated and replied, 2 nights ago. He said he was going to meet a business associate, but he never came back. Inspector Femi nodded, his expression unreadable, and he asked again, and you didn't think to report him missing until his secretary called? I didn't want to believe something was wrong, Delilah stammered. I thought he would come back. Inspector Femi smiled faintly. Of course, grief can cloud judgments. He stood, his movements deliberate. If you think of anything else, don't hesitate to call. As he left, Delilah watched him from the window, her composure cracking for the first time. He knows something, she muttered to herself. Uchenna's phone buzzed that evening. It was Delilah. We need to meet, she said, her tone sharp. They met at a secluded bar on the mainland, far from the prying eyes. That Inspector Femi is sniffing around too much, she said, leaning in. We need to move the body. Uchenna recoiled. Are you insane? The mansion is crawling with police. How do you plan to get the body out of the freezer without being caught? Delilah's lips curved into a bitter smile, and she said, that's where you come in. I've arranged for the security cameras to go off tonight. You will move the body to my car, and I'll take it from there. I am not doing this, Uchenna said, his voice shaking. I am done. This has gone too far. Delilah's eyes hardened, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, and she said, you're already in too deep. If I go down, you will go down with me. Meanwhile, Inspector Femi wasn't idle. Back at the station, he pored over Pa Martin's Obaro's financial records, his instincts telling him this was no ordinary disappearance. A junior officer knocked on the door, handing him a folder. Sir, we found something in the mansion, the officer said. Traces of fluid substance in the basement. It was wiped clean, but not well enough. Inspector Femi's eyes narrowed, and he said, and what about the wife? She is sticking to her story, the officer replied, but there is something else. One of the neighbors reported seeing a man visiting the house frequently, a younger man. Inspector Femi leaned back in his chair, his mind racing, and he said, find out who he is. That night, Uchenna found himself back at the mansion, his hands trembling as usual. As he approached the basement freezer, Delilah was waiting for him, her face a mark of determination. Open the freezer, she ordered. Uchenna hesitated, every fiber of his being screaming at him to run. But the fear of what Delilah might do kept him rooted to the spot. He opened the freezer, the cold air rushing out like a ghostly whisper. Pa Martin's body lay there, eerily preserved, his lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. We need to hurry, Delilah said, grabbing one end of the body. As they lifted Pa Martin's corpse, a sudden sound froze them in place. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Who is there? Delilah hissed, her voice barely audible. The basement door cracked open, and a figure stepped in. It was one of Pa Martin's sons from his first marriage. Pa Martin had 3 sons from his first wife, but he divorced her 5 years ago and married Delilah. Chike is the first son, a man in his early 40s with a commanding presence. What the hell is going on here? Chike demanded, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Delilah's mind raced. Chike, it's not what it looks like. Oh, it looks like you are moving my father's body, Chike said coldly. And I think the police will be very interested in hearing about this. Delilah quickly attacked him, her movements frantic. Chike easily overpowered her, pinning her against the wall. You disgust me, he spat. You think you can come into my family and destroy everything. Uchenna tried to run away, but Chike's voice stopped him. And you, he said, his tone venomous. Where do you think you are going? Chike pulled out his phone, dialing a number. Inspector Femi, tell your boys outside the house to move in. As the sound of the sirens filled the air, Uchenna's world crumbled. He looked at Delilah, her face a mask of fury and despair. For the first time, he realized just how far she would go to save herself and how much he had lost by following her down this path. The mansion was a cacophony of chaos. Sirens blared outside, red and blue lights piercing the darkness. Inspector Femi and his team swarmed the premises, armed with warrants and determination. Inside, Uchenna and Delilah sat handcuffed in the lavish living room, their faces pale with dread. Chike sat in the living room, his expression unreadable. He had been calm through the commotion, but his eyes burned with fury. And he said, "You thought you could get away with it. You thought we wouldn't see through your lies." Delilah's composure cracked and she glared at him. "You have no proof," she spat. "You are bluffing." Inspector Femi stepped forward, holding a paper. "We have enough evidence to bury you, Mrs. Obaro. Traces of blood in the basement, witness testimonies, and now your little accomplice here." He turned to Uchenna, his eyes narrowing. "Are you ready to talk?" Uchenna's head dropped. The weight of guilt was unbearable, and he replied, "It was her idea. She planned everything. I just needed money." Delilah's eyes widened in disbelief, and she spat. "You coward! Don't dare pin this on me." But it was too late. Uchenna's confession was the final nail in the coffin. As the police began to process the scene, a commotion erupted outside. One of the police officers ran in. "Sir, we found another body in the guest house." Inspector Femi frowned. "Another body?" The officer nodded. "Yes, it is one of the mansion staff. Looks like he was silenced to keep the plot under wraps." Femi's mind raced. This wasn't just a simple murder for money scheme. This was a web of deceit, greed, wickedness that spiraled out of control. "Seal the property," Inspector Femi ordered. "No one goes in or out until we have searched everywhere." In the chaos, Uchenna's panic grew. He glanced at Delilah, who seemed strangely calm despite the situation. Her lips curved into a sinister smile. "You would think they will let you off easy," she whispered. "They will throw you in prison for life, Uchenna. But for me, I will find a way out. I always do." Her words sent a chill down his spine. He realized then that Delilah wasn't just manipulative, she was very evil. Uchenna knew she must have been the one who killed the mansion staff, maybe to cover up something, and now they might also pin the death on him. Hours later, as the police wrapped their investigation, Inspector Femi received a call that made his blood run cold. "Inspector," the voice on the other end said, "we have traced Mrs. Obaro's financial transaction. She transferred a significant amount of money to an offshore account just days before her husband's disappearance." Inspector Femi's jaw tightened. "She was planning to flee," he muttered. He stormed back into the mansion where Delilah and Uchenna were being held. He stared at her, his eyes blazing, and he asked, "You were going to run away, weren't you?" Delilah's smile never faltered. "Prove it," she said, her voice dripping with defiance. But Femi didn't need to prove it. He had everything he needed to ensure she would never see the outside world again. As dawn broke over the mansion, Delilah and Uchenna were escorted out in handcuffs, their lives in ruins. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later in prison, Uchenna received a visitor. It was Chike, his face stern. He looked at Uchenna with disgust and said, "I came to tell you that you are the reason my father is dead. You let greed and wickedness destroy you." Uchenna's voice cracked and he replied, "I didn't want this. I was desperate." Chike's expression hardened. Desperation doesn't excuse evil. You will live with this guilt for the rest of your miserable life. Delilah, on the other hand, found herself isolated in her cell. Her beauty, once her greatest weapon, was useless here. Rumors spread that she had tried to bribe the judge, but it didn't work. Her charm couldn't save her this time. One night in the cold cell, she realized that the game was up and that she would most likely spend the rest of her life in prison. She cried out loud in pain. The Obaro estate was returned to Chike and his brothers. In the end, the crime Delilah and Uchenna thought was perfect unraveled before their eyes, leaving them with nothing but regret.